30 hunters entered the Ozark woods. Nobody returned. The Creepiest case of 1888. Beacon Hollow, Missouri, November. 30 men paid a guide named Ethan Dufresne $12 each for an elk hunt. Then they vanished. 3 years later, I found a half-burned ledger in my father's cold stove. Inside, 30 names, 30 deposits, and a note in his hand that said, "Asked Marshall twice, no answer, let it rest." I walked to the general store. The owner still had the receipts, 8 shovels, 12 bottles of laudanum, 50 feet of rope. He looked at me and said, "No hunt needs 8 shovels." Then I found the journal. Water damaged. Pulled from Beacon Creek. The last entry said, "Woke in a pit, can't climb out. Dufresne's voice above." This is how their secret finally surfaced. Through ink my father tried to burn and ground that wouldn't stay quiet. When the law protects predators and the town goes silent, who pays the price to dig up 30 graves? Drop a comment with where you're watching from and your local time. These stories reach further than we know. Subscribe to keep the truth alive and honor the ones who were silenced. Molly Kern was 19 years old the morning she found the ledger, and she would spend the next year wishing she had left it in the stove where her father meant it to stay. It was November of 1891, 3 years to the month since 30 men walked into Beacon Hollow and never walked out. And the Greene County courthouse smelled like old paper and regret. Her father had been dead 2 weeks. Pneumonia, the doctor said, but Molly had watched him waste for months before that, coughing into his handkerchief and staring at nothing when he thought no one was looking. Thomas Kern had been county clerk for 26 years, and he kept everything. Receipts from 1863, tax records with margins full of calculations, letters from circuit judges folded into envelopes that still held the shapes of their original creases. Molly had promised her mother she would clear the office by Christmas so the new clerk could take over in January, and she had been working through the filing cabinets for 3 days when she noticed the wood stove in the corner had never been emptied. She knelt in front of it and pulled open the iron door. The ash was cold and gray, months old, maybe a year. Her father had stopped lighting fires in the office sometime before he got sick. She reached inside and felt something solid beneath the powder, leather. She pulled it free and ash fell from the cover like snow. The binding was half burned, the edges black and curled, but the pages inside were mostly intact. She carried it to the desk by the window where the light was better and opened it flat. The first page said, Springfield Hunting Club in careful script, then 1888 roster and accounts below that. She turned the page. 30 names ran down the left side in alphabetical order. Next to each name was a date between August and October of 1888, then a figure, $12. In the far right column, every entry said the same thing. Guide fee, E. Dufresne. Molly did not recognize most of the names, but she knew James Calloway. He had taught her arithmetic when she was 11. She remembered his voice, patient and slow, explaining fractions with apples drawn on a slate board. She had not thought of him in years. She turned through the rest of the ledger. More entries, supplies purchased, dates of meetings. A note at the bottom of one page said, "Departure planned November 7th." Then nothing. The next 5 pages were blank, except for a single line written in her father's hand. Near the bottom of the final entry, it said, "Asked Marshall twice. No answer. Let it rest." Molly sat very still. She read the line again. Her father's handwriting was cramped and small, the way it got when he was upset. She closed the ledger and looked at the stove. He had tried to burn this. Not all of it, just enough. Enough to make it disappear, but not enough to destroy it completely. She wondered how long he had kept it before he decided to let it go. She wondered if he had stood here in this office, alone, feeding pages into the fire one at a time, and then stopped. She wondered what had made him stop. She wrapped the ledger in a flour sack and carried it home. Her mother was in the kitchen kneading bread and did not ask what was in the sack. Molly went upstairs to her room and hid it under her mattress. That night she could not sleep. She kept thinking about the names. 30 men, $12 each. A guide named Dufresne. She did not know what it meant, but she knew her father had thought it was dangerous enough to burn and sad enough to stop burning. The next morning she walked to the town square. It was cold and the sky was low and gray. She went to the dry goods store first. Mr. Pace was behind the counter sorting nails into wooden bins. He looked up when the door opened and nodded. Molly asked if he remembered the Springfield Hunting Club. His hands stopped moving. He set the nails down slowly and wiped his palms on his apron. He said he remembered. She asked what happened to them. He looked past her toward the window and said they went into Beacon Hollow with Ethan Dufresne in November of '88 and never came out. She asked if anyone looked for them. He shook his head. He said the marshal asked around for a week or two, then let it go. He said folks figured they got lost or fell into a sinkhole or maybe just decided to keep walking west. He said it was a long time ago. Molly thanked him and left. She went to the drugstore next. The pharmacist was older, 60 at least, and he had lived in Springfield all his life. She asked the same question. He gave her the same answer, almost word for word. 30 men. Beacon Hollow, Ethan Dufresne. Never came out. She asked if he thought it was strange that 30 men could vanish, and no one did. Anything. He looked at her the way you look at someone who is asking a question they should not ask. He said it was strange, yes, but Dufresne had friends, and the men had no families in town, and after a while people stopped asking because there was nothing to find. He said her father had tried to push it once, back when it happened, but the marshal told him to let it rest. He said Thomas Kern was a good man who knew when to stop. Molly walked back across the square. The air smelled like smoke from a dozen chimneys. She thought about her father sitting in his office, writing that note in the ledger. Asked Marshall twice. No answer. Let it rest. She thought about him trying to burn it and then stopping. She thought about 30 names and 30 deposits and a guide who had friends. She realized that the silence was not an accident. The silence was a choice. The silence was the crime. She went home and pulled the ledger out from under her mattress. She opened it to the first page and read the names again, one by one, and decided that whatever her father could not finish, she would. Molly went back to the general store 3 days later with a notebook and a pencil. Mr. Pace was restocking shelves when she walked in. She told him she needed to see his receipt books from 1888, specifically October. He stopped what he was doing and looked at her for a long moment. Then he nodded and went into the back room. When he returned, he was carrying a leather-bound ledger thick with yellowed pages. He set it on the counter between them and opened it to October. He said she could look, but she could not take it with her. She said that was fine. She pulled up a stool and started reading. The entries were organized by date and customer name. Most of them were ordinary: flour, sugar, lamp oil, fabric. She turned pages slowly, running her finger down each column, looking for the name Dufresne. She found it on October 14th, 40 pounds salt pork, 20 pounds hardtack, 6 canvas tarps. Total cost $4.30. She copied it into her notebook. She kept reading. October 21st, 8 shovels, 2 pickaxes, 50 feet of rope, $6.75. She wrote that down, too. October 28th, 12 bottles laudanum, medicinal grade, $3 even. She stared at that last entry for a long time, 12 bottles. She looked up at Mr. Pace. He was watching her from across the store. She asked why anyone would need 12 bottles of laudanum for a hunting trip. He came over and stood beside her and looked down at the page. He said quietly that Ethan had told him it was for pain relief in case someone got injured in the woods. He said he had believed that at the time because Ethan was a guide and guides prepared for everything. Then he said that no hunt needs 8 shovels. His voice was flat when he said it, like he had been carrying the weight of that sentence for 3 years and was tired of holding it, alone. Molly asked if he had told anyone about the orders back when the men disappeared. He shook his head. He said he mentioned it to the marshal once, casual-like, and the marshal said Ethan Dufresne was a professional, and professionals bought what they needed. He said the marshal made it clear the conversation was over. Molly thanked him and closed her notebook. She walked out into the cold and stood on the wooden sidewalk for a moment, thinking. 8 shovels, 50 feet of rope, 12 bottles of laudanum. She thought about 30 men drinking coffee by a campfire. She thought about how bitter laudanum tasted and how easy it would be to hide that bitterness in strong coffee. She thought about men falling asleep and not waking up where they expected to. She borrowed her mother's horse the next morning and rode west out of town toward Beacon Hollow. The road was narrow and rutted, and it wound through bare trees that looked like bones against the sky. It took her an hour to reach the trailhead. She had never been this far out before. The woods here were old and thick, and the silence felt wrong, too heavy, like the air itself was holding its breath. She dismounted and tied the horse to a tree and walked into the hollow on foot. The trail was overgrown with brush and fallen branches. No one had used it in years. She pushed through the undergrowth, her skirt catching on thorns, until she came to a clearing about 100 yards in. In the center of the clearing was a ring of stones, blackened by old fires. She walked over to it and knelt down. The ground around the fire ring was soft, almost spongy, like it had been disturbed and never fully settled. In the middle of the ring, driven deep into the earth, was a surveyor's stake. It was weathered and split, but still upright. She pulled it free and turned it over in her hands. Carved into the wood were the initials ED, and below that the words, Claim 1888. Molly stood up slowly. She looked around the clearing. The trees pressed in on all sides. The ground sloped down toward a creek she could hear but not see. She tried to imagine 30 men camped here, drinking coffee, talking about the hunt ahead. She tried to imagine them falling silent one by one as the laudanum took hold. She tried to imagine Ethan Dufresne standing where she was standing now, watching them sleep, knowing what came next. Her stomach turned. She put the stake back where she found it and walked back to the horse. That afternoon she went to the county land office. The clerk was a thin man with spectacles who did not look up when she came in. She asked to see the mineral rights claims filed in December of 1888. He sighed and pointed to a cabinet in the corner. She found the right drawer and pulled out a stack of documents tied with string. Most of them were claims filed on land near the rivers where people hoped to find lead or zinc. She went through them one by one until she found what she was looking for. A claim filed on December 9, 1888, for a parcel of land described as the eastern basin of Beacon Hollow, approximately 40 acres. The name on the claim was Ethan Dufresne. The filing date was exactly 1 month after the hunting party disappeared. Molly sat down at the clerk's desk without asking and read the document twice. Dufresne had claimed the land for copper mining. He had submitted an assay report that said the soil showed promising mineral content. He had paid the filing fee and signed his name in bold, confident script. She looked at the date again. December 9th, 1 month. She thought about the shovels and the rope and the surveyor's stake planted in the clearing. She thought about her father's note in the ledger. Asked Marshall twice. No answer. Let it rest. She realized then that Ethan Dufresne had not guided those men into the woods. He had prepared the ground. He had bought the tools and the tarps and the laudanum weeks in advance. He had chosen the location and marked it with a stake. He had planned every step. And when it was over, when 30 men were buried in soft earth that would settle and compact and look like nothing had ever happened, he had filed a legal claim on the land so no one else would ever dig there. The mineral rights were a lie. The copper was a lie. The only thing Ethan Dufresne had ever mined from Beacon Hollow was silence, and he had bought it with 30 lives and $12 each. Molly heard about the satchel from a postal rider named Webb, who stopped at her mother's house in early December to deliver a package. He was drinking coffee at the kitchen table when he mentioned it, casual and offhand, the way people talk about old news that no longer matters. He said a trapper had found a rotted leather bag near Beacon Creek back in the spring of 1889, maybe 4 months after the hunters went missing. The trapper brought it to the post office thinking someone might claim it, but no one ever did. Webb said it sat in the lost property box for a year before someone threw it out. Molly set down her cup. She asked what was inside. Webb shrugged. He said there was a journal, water-damaged and barely readable, and a pocket watch with an engraving. He said the postmaster had looked at it once and then put it away because it made him uncomfortable. Molly asked if he remembered the engraving. Webb thought for a moment. He said it was initials, J.C. or J.K., something like that. Then he finished his coffee and left. Molly went to the post office the next morning. The postmaster was sorting mail when she walked in. She asked about the satchel. He stopped sorting and looked at her. He said he did not have it anymore. She asked where it went. He said he gave it to the marshal 3 years ago when it became clear no one was coming to claim it. He said the marshal told him to forget about it. Molly thanked him and walked straight to the marshal's office. Marshal Harlan. Voss was sitting behind his desk reading a newspaper when she came in. He looked up and smiled the way men smile when they are being polite, but not welcoming. She asked about the satchel from Beacon Creek. The smile faded. He folded the newspaper slowly and set it aside. He asked why she was asking. She told him she was going through her father's records and had found references to the Springfield Hunting Club. She said she wanted to know what happened to them. Voss leaned back in his chair. He said what happened was they went into the woods and did not come back, and that was the end of it. She asked if he still had the satchel. He said he did not. She asked what was in it. He stared at her for a long moment. Then he said there was a journal that was too damaged to read, and a watch that did not prove anything. He said he had looked into it at the time and found nothing worth pursuing. He said her father had understood that. He said she should understand it too. Molly did not move. She asked where the satchel was now. Voss stood up. He was a large man, and he used his size deliberately. He said the satchel was gone, thrown out or burned, he could not remember which. He said she was wasting her time and his. He said grief made people see conspiracies where there were none, and that she should go home and let the past stay buried. She looked at him and realized he was lying. She did not know which part was the lie, but she knew the whole shape of his answer was wrong. She thanked him and left. She thought about the satchel all week, a journal, a pocket watch. Initials J.C. She went back to the ledger and found the name James Calloway. He had been a school teacher, 37 years old, paid his $12 on September 20th. She remembered his voice. She remembered the way he drew apples on a slate board. She went to the school and asked if anyone knew where his family had lived. The headmaster said Calloway had no family in Springfield, that he had come from St. Louis 5 years earlier and lived alone in a rented room above the tailor shop. He said after Calloway disappeared, the landlord sold his belongings to cover unpaid rent. Molly asked if anything had been saved. The headmaster said he did not know. She went to the tailor. He was an old man who did not remember much, but he remembered Calloway. He said the teacher had kept to himself mostly, read a lot, took long walks. He said after a few months passed and Calloway did not return, he boxed up the man's things and stored them in the attic. He said no one ever came asking for them. Molly asked if the boxes were still there. The tailor nodded. He took her upstairs and pulled down a wooden crate covered in dust. Inside were clothes, books, a shaving kit, and at the bottom, wrapped in oilcloth, a leather-bound journal. It was water-stained and warped, the pages stuck together in places. Molly asked if she could borrow it. The tailor said she could keep it. He said he should have thrown it out years ago. She took the journal home and spent 2 hours carefully separating the pages. Most of them were ruined. The ink bled into blue-gray ghosts of words. But the final entries were legible. She read them by lamplight with her hands shaking. November 9th, 1888. Dufresne says the elk run thick past the ridge. We camp tonight, November 10th. He offered us coffee. Tasted bitter. Men are sluggish. Cannot keep my eyes open. November 11th. Woke in a pit. Cannot climb out. Dufresne's voice above, ground is soft here. You will settle fast. The sentence ended halfway through. The rest of the page was blank. Molly read it 3 times. Then she closed the journal and sat in the dark. She thought about James Calloway waking up in a hole in the ground, unable to move, unable to climb, listening to Ethan Dufresne's voice from above. She thought about 29 other men waking up the same way, or maybe not waking up at all. She thought about how long it took. She thought about the shovels. The next morning she took the journal to the town doctor. His name was Brennan, and he had been practicing for 30 years. She showed him the entry about the bitter coffee and the sluggishness. She asked if laudanum could do that. He read the passage carefully. He said laudanum in sufficient quantity could render a grown man unconscious in minutes, especially if mixed with something hot that would speed absorption. He said 12 bottles would be enough to dose 30 men with room to spare. He asked where she got the journal. She told him. He handed it back and said she should take it to the marshal. She said she already tried. He nodded slowly. He said he was sorry. He said sometimes the law was not interested in justice, only in order, and that the two were not the same thing. Molly left his office and walked home. She had the ledger, the receipts, the land claim, and now the journal. She had everything except the bodies, and without the bodies she had nothing the law would touch. She thought about her father's note, asked Marshall twice, no answer. Let it rest. She understood now why he had tried to burn the ledger. He had known what she was learning, that the truth without power was just ink on paper, that 30 men could die and be forgotten if the right people decided forgetting was easier than remembering. Molly walked into Marshal Voss's office on December 18, 1891, carrying everything she had found, the ledger with 30 names and her father's note, the copied receipts from the general store, the land claim filed 1 month after the disappearance, the journal with James Calloway's final words. She laid them on the marshal's desk one by one, not speaking, just letting the evidence accumulate in front of him like stones. Voss watched her with his arms crossed. When she finished, she stepped back and waited. He picked up the ledger first and flipped through it slowly. Then he set it down and looked at the receipts. He spent a long time on the journal, reading the final entries twice. When he was done, he leaned back in his chair and rubbed his face with both hands. He was quiet for a full minute. Then he said there were no bodies. Molly said the journal proved what happened. He said the journal proved a man wrote some words in a book, nothing more. She said the receipts showed premeditation. He said the receipts showed a man bought supplies. She said the land claim showed motive. He said the land claim showed a man filed paperwork. He said without bodies, without witnesses, without anything but her suspicions and some old documents, there was no case. He said Ethan Dufresne had friends in the State House, people who would make trouble if accusations were thrown around carelessly. He said her father had understood this. He said she needed to understand it too. Molly asked if he had understood it in 1888 when the men first disappeared. Voss's face darkened. He said he had done his job. He said he asked questions and found no answers, and eventually moved on because that was what lawmen did when trails went cold. She asked why he never searched Beacon Hollow. He said he had no reason to search there. She asked why he never questioned Dufresne about the shovels and the laudanum. He said supplies were not crimes. She asked why her father had burned the ledger. Voss stood up. He said her father was a smart man who knew when to let things rest and that she should follow his example. He said he was sorry for her loss, but that grief was not an investigation. He said she should go home. He picked up the documents and held them out to her. She took them and left without another word. She went to the offices of the Springfield Republican the next day. The editor was a man named Howell who wore ink-stained shirt sleeves and smelled like tobacco. She told him the whole story. She showed him the evidence. She said she wanted him to print it. He listened and looked at the documents and then shook his head. He said accusations without remains were libel, not news. She said the journal was proof. He said the journal was hearsay from a dead man. She said the receipts and the land claim established a pattern. He said patterns were not proof. He said if she could bring him bodies or a confession or something a court would recognize, he would print every word. He said until then he could not risk a lawsuit. He said Ethan Dufresne had money and lawyers, and she had paper. He said he was sorry. She folded the documents back into her satchel and walked out into the cold. Winter came down hard that year. Snow fell in thick, silent curtains and covered the roads and the fields and the woods. Molly watched it from her window and felt it covering Beacon Hollow, too, covering the clearing and the fire ring and the soft ground where 30 men lay buried. She thought about how easy it was for the world to bury things. Snow, time, silence. She had tried the law, and the law had turned her away. She had tried the press, and the press had turned her away. She had done what her father could not do, and it had not been enough. She rode out to Beacon Hollow one last time in January of 1892. The trail was impassable with snow, so she tied the horse at the road and walked in on foot. It took her nearly an hour to reach the clearing. Everything was white and still. The fire ring was buried. The trees were bare and black against the sky. She stood there for a long time, thinking about James Calloway and the 29 other men whose names she had memorized. She thought about Ethan Dufresne, alive and untouched, living on land he had bought with murder. She thought about her father, who had tried and failed and died with the failure unfinished. She walked deeper into the hollow, past the clearing, following the slope down toward the creek. The ground was uneven under the snow, rising and falling in soft mounds. She stopped and looked around. The mounds were everywhere, spread across the basin in no particular pattern. She knelt and brushed the snow away from one of them. The earth beneath was dark and loose, different from the rocky soil everywhere else in the Ozarks. She stood up slowly. This was it. This was where they were. Not in a single grave, but scattered, buried shallow in ground that Dufresne had spent weeks preparing. She thought about the shovels. She thought about the tarps. She thought about one man, alone, working by lamplight, digging 30 holes before the hunting party ever arrived. She walked back to the road and rode home. That night she took the ledger and the journal and all the receipts and the land claim and put them in her father's old trunk in the attic. She locked it and put the key in a drawer. She did not know what else to do. The evidence was real, but the world did not care. Justice required more than truth. It required power, and she had none. She stopped asking questions. She stopped going to the courthouse and the marshal's office and the newspaper. She went to church on Sundays and helped her mother with the house and tried to forget, but she could not forget. Every time she walked past the courthouse, she thought about her father sitting at his desk, writing that note in the ledger. Every time she saw Marshal Voss in town, she thought about the way he had looked at her when he said there were no bodies. Every time it snowed, she thought about Beacon Hollow and the soft ground and the 30 men no one remembered. Winter stretched into spring. The snow melted, and the roads turned to mud. Molly turned 20 in March. She felt older. She had learned what her father learned, that some crimes were too big to fight, that some men were too protected to touch, that silence could outlast truth if enough people chose not to listen. She had tried to finish his work and failed, and the failure sat in her chest like a stone she would carry the rest of her life. The surveyor arrived in Springfield on a Tuesday morning in late April of 1892. His name was Charles Reed, and he worked for a mining investment firm out of St. Louis. He checked into the hotel with a trunk full of equipment and a letter of commission that authorized him to assess the mineral value of Ethan Dufresne's claim in Beacon Hollow. The firm was considering purchasing the rights, and Reed's job was to determine whether the copper deposits Dufresne claimed were real. He was 29 years old and had been surveying mines for 6 years. He did not know anything about Springfield or its history. He did not know about 30 missing hunters or a county clerk who tried to burn a ledger or a girl who had spent 4 months chasing ghosts through receipts and land records. He knew only that he had a job to do, and he was good at his job. He rode out to Beacon Hollow on Wednesday with his instruments and his maps. Dufresne met him at the trailhead. They shook hands, and Dufresne led him into the hollow, talking the whole way about soil composition and mineral indicators, and how promising the site looked. Reed listened politely and made notes. When they reached the clearing, Dufresne showed him where he thought the richest deposits would be. Reed unpacked his equipment and spent the afternoon taking measurements and marking locations for test shafts. Everything looked plausible on the surface. The soil had the right color. The rock formations were consistent with copper-bearing geology. But Reed had learned not to trust surfaces. He told Dufresne he would need to sink a few test shafts to confirm what was below. Dufresne agreed and left him to his work. Reed returned Thursday morning with a crew of 2 men and a wagon full of digging tools. They started in the clearing where Dufresne had indicated, sinking a shaft 4 feet square and 8 feet deep. The ground was soft, easier to dig than Reed expected. They hit bedrock at 7 feet and found nothing. No copper, no mineral traces, just dirt and stone. Reed made a note and moved to a second location 50 yards south. Same result. Soft ground, easy digging, no minerals. He was starting to suspect Dufresne's assay report was optimistic at best, fraudulent at worst. He decided to try one more shaft on the eastern edge of the basin where the ground sloped toward the creek. They started digging Friday morning. The earth came up in dark, loose clumps. At 3 feet down, one of the crew hit something that was not rock. He called Reed over. Reed knelt at the edge of the shaft and looked down. There was fabric visible in the sidewall, rotted and stained, but still recognizably cloth. He reached down and brushed the soil away carefully. The fabric was attached to something. He dug further and uncovered what looked like a coat sleeve, then a hand, then bone. Reed stood up and stepped back from the shaft. His hands were shaking. He told the crew to stop digging. He walked back to town and went straight to the marshal's office. Voss was at his desk when Reed came in. Reed told him what they had found. Voss did not move for a moment. Then he stood up and grabbed his coat and followed Reed back to Beacon Hollow. They reached the site an hour later. Voss looked into the test shaft and then looked at Reed. He asked if there was more than one body. Reed said he did not know. They had stopped as soon as they realized what they had found. Voss told the crew to keep digging, but to do it carefully. They worked through the afternoon. By evening, they had uncovered 3 complete skeletons in the first shaft. Voss ordered them to dig a second shaft 20 feet away. They found 4 more bodies. A third shaft revealed 5. The ground was full of them, buried shallow and scattered across the basin exactly the way Molly had imagined when she stood there in the snow 4 months earlier. Voss sent a rider to fetch the county coroner. The coroner arrived Saturday morning and spent 2 days examining the remains. He counted 17 skeletons before part of the basin collapsed into a sinkhole and sealed the rest. He said the bodies had been in the ground approximately 4 years. He said there was evidence of trauma on some of the skulls, but the soil conditions made it difficult to determine cause of death. He said it was the largest mass grave he had ever seen. Molly heard about the discovery on Sunday. A neighbor told her mother, and her mother told her. Molly did not say anything. She went upstairs to the attic and unlocked her father's trunk. She took out the ledger and the journal and the receipts and the land claim. She wrapped them in oilcloth and carried them to the marshal's office. Voss was there with the coroner and 2 deputies. She walked in and set the bundle on his desk. She said she had brought him his bodies. She said now maybe he would look at the evidence. Voss opened the bundle and stared at the documents. He had seen them before 4 months earlier, and he had sent her away. Now he read them again, slowly, and his face went gray. The Springfield Republican ran the story on the front page Tuesday morning. 30 hunters missing since 1888. 17 bodies recovered from land owned by their guide. Evidence of premeditation. Receipts for shovels and laudanum. A journal describing drugged coffee and a pit. A land claim filed 1 month after the disappearance. The article named Ethan Dufresne and printed his address. It included a statement from Marshal Voss saying an arrest warrant had been issued. It included excerpts from James Calloway's journal. It included a list of all 30 names from the Springfield Hunting Club roster. Dufresne was arrested Tuesday afternoon. They found him at his cabin packing a bag. He did not resist. They took him to the county jail and locked him in a cell on the 2nd floor. He did not speak except to say he wanted a lawyer. The trial was scheduled for June. He never made it to trial. On Thursday morning, the night guard found him hanging from a bedsheet tied to the cell bars. The coroner ruled it suicide. The town did not believe it. There were rumors that someone had come in the night, that Dufresne had been helped along, that men with something to hide had decided a dead guide was safer than a talking one. No investigation was opened. Voss wrote it up as suicide and closed the case. The bodies were buried in a mass grave at Riverview Cemetery in May of 1892. The town paid for a stone marker that listed all 30 names and said, "Justice delayed, not denied." Molly attended the burial with her mother. She stood at the back of the crowd and watched them lower the coffins into the ground. She thought about her father and the ledger he tried to burn and the note he wrote when he gave up. She thought about the 4 months she had spent chasing the truth through receipts and land records and journals, believing it would matter, believing someone would listen. She had been wrong. No one had listened. Not the marshal, not the newspaper, not the law. The truth had stayed buried until the land itself gave it back. After the service, she walked to the courthouse. She went to her father's old office, now occupied by the new clerk. She asked if she could donate something to the county archive. The clerk said yes. She gave him the ledger, the journal, the receipts, and the land claim, all labeled and documented. She said they were evidence from the Beacon Hollow case. She said they needed to be preserved. The clerk thanked her and filed them away. Molly walked out into the spring sunlight and went home. The story would outlive the silence now. That was all her father had ever wanted. That was all she had wanted too.